spooky place.
Some houses are haunted by ghosts. Hollow Hill House is haunted by something far worse. It doesn't just trap you inside. It gets inside you, twisting your mind until you can't tell where the house ends and you begin. Sleep well tonight, if you can. Before we begin, I request you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. On that note, let's begin. The house on Hollow Hill. It was a crisp October evening when 5 friends, Emma, Jake, Mia, Ryan, and Chris, decided to explore the infamous Hollow Hill House. The abandoned mansion sat on the edge of town, shrouded in legends of disappearances, ghostly apparitions, and unspeakable horrors. No one had lived there for over a century, but the stories kept the townsfolk away. For the group of friends, it was the perfect dare. They arrived at the house just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. The house loomed before them, its windows shattered, its roof sagging, and its front door hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. A cold wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. "This is it," Jake said, grinning as he shone his flashlight on the crumbling facade. "The most haunted house in the state. You guys ready?" Emma hesitated, her gut twisting with unease. "I don't know. This feels different. What if the stories are true?" "Come on, Em," Chris teased. "You're not scared, are you? It's just an old house." Despite her reservations, Emma followed the group inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked ominously under their weight. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the faint outlines of old portraits hung crookedly, their eyes seeming to follow the intruders. They split up to explore, promising to stay within earshot. Mia and Ryan headed upstairs, while Jake, Chris, and Emma stayed on the ground floor. The house seemed to groan and shift around them, as if it were alive. Upstairs, Mia and Ryan found a room filled with broken furniture and a large, ornate mirror. As Ryan joked about seeing a ghost in the reflection, the door behind them slammed shut. They laughed nervously, but when they tried to open it, the knob wouldn't turn. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and their breath came out in visible puffs. The mirror fogged up, and a single word appeared, scrawled as if by an invisible hand: "Leave." Downstairs, Emma heard a faint whisper in her ear. She spun around, but no one was there. Jake and Chris were a few feet away, examining an old piano. The whisper came again, louder this time, a voice she didn't recognize. "Get out," it hissed. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Jake asked, but before she could answer, the piano keys slammed down on their own, playing a discordant, haunting tune. The friends froze, their flashlights flickering. Upstairs, Mia and Ryan were pounding on the door, screaming for help. The mirror cracked, and a shadowy figure emerged, reaching for them. They backed away, but the figure moved faster, its hollow eyes glowing with malice. Downstairs, the walls began to bleed, dark rivulets of liquid oozing from the cracks. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. "You shouldn't have come," they said. "Now you'll stay forever." Emma grabbed Jake's arm. "We need to leave. Now." But as they turned to run, the front door slammed shut. The windows darkened, and the house seemed to close in around them. The floorboard splintered, and something clawed its way up from below, a skeletal hand, followed by another, and another. The dead were rising, their hollow eyes fixed on the intruders. Upstairs, Mia and Ryan managed to break the door down, but the shadowy figure pursued them, its form shifting and twisting. They stumbled down the stairs, only to find their friends surrounded by the undead. "What do we do?" Mia screamed. "The basement," Chris shouted, remembering an old legend about a hidden exit. They fought their way through the grasping hands, their flashlights flickering as they descended into the darkness. The basement was a maze of rusted pipes and crumbling walls, but they could hear the sound of running water, a stream that ran beneath the house. As the dead closed in, they found a narrow tunnel leading outside. One by one, they crawled through, the cold, damp earth pressing in on them. When they finally emerged, they were covered in dirt and scratches, but alive. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the property. When they turned back, the house was gone, replaced by an empty field. The Hollow Hill house had vanished, as if it had never existed. But the friends knew better. They could still hear the whispers, faint but persistent, echoing in their minds. And though they never spoke of that night again, they all felt it, the lingering presence of the house, waiting for them to return. Years later, Emma would swear she saw the house again, just for a moment, on the edge of her vision. And when she turned to look, she heard the whispers once more. "You'll come back." They always do. The friends thought they had escaped the horrors of Hollow Hill House, but the nightmare was far from over. Weeks after their ordeal, strange things began happening. Objects moved on their own, shadows flickered in the corners of their vision, and the whispers, those terrible whispers, followed them everywhere. One night, Emma was alone in her apartment when she heard a faint knock at her door. Her heart raced as she peered through the peephole, but no one was there. She opened the door cautiously, only to find a small, dusty box on her doorstep. Inside was an old photograph of the five of them. Taken the night, they explored the house. But something was wrong. Their faces were blurred, and behind them, in the shadows of the house, stood the shadowy figure they had seen that night. Emma called the group, and they decided to meet at Jake's place to figure out what was going on. As they gathered, they realized they had all been experiencing similar phenomena. Mia had woken up to find her bedroom walls covered in the same word from the mirror: leave. Ryan had seen the skeletal hands clawing at his window in the middle of the night. Chris had heard the piano playing in his empty living room. "It's not over," Emma said, her voice shaking. "The house is still with us." Before they could discuss further, the lights in Jake's apartment flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, and the temperature dropped. The whispers began again, louder this time, overlapping into a deafening roar. The walls seemed to close in, and the floor beneath them shifted, as if they were being pulled back into the house. Suddenly, the room was no longer Jake's apartment. They were back in the Hollow Hill house, standing in the foyer. The door slammed shut behind them, and the house seemed to come alive, its walls pulsating like a living organism. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the whispers were now screams. "We have to get out of here," Ryan shouted, but as they turned to run, the floorboards splintered, and the skeletal hands emerged again, grasping at their ankles. They fought their way through, but the house seemed to shift and change, leading them in circles. Every door they opened led to another nightmare. A room filled with mirrors that reflected their worst fears. A hallway that stretched endlessly. A staircase that led to nowhere. As they ran, they heard a familiar tune, the discordant piano music from their first visit. It grew louder, echoing through the halls, and they realized it was coming from the basement. Against their better judgment, they followed the sound, hoping it might lead them to the hidden exit they had used before. But when they reached the basement, they found something far worse. The shadowy figure was waiting for them, its form shifting and twisting, its hollow eyes glowing with malice. Behind it, the walls were lined with photographs, hundreds of them, all of people who had entered the house and never left. Their faces were twisted in agony, their eyes wide with terror. "You shouldn't have come back," the figure hissed, its voice a chorus of the dead. "Now you'll join them." The friends turned to run, but the walls closed in, trapping them. The skeletal hands emerged from the floor, pulling them down. The whispers grew louder, drowning out their screams. Just as all hope seemed lost, Emma remembered something. a story she had heard about the house's original owner, a man who had performed dark rituals to gain immortality. The house was his prison, and the only way to escape was to break the curse. "We have to destroy it," she shouted. "The house, it's alive. We have to burn it down." With the last of their strength, they fought their way to the surface, using their lighters and anything flammable they could find to start a fire. The house screamed as the flames spread, its walls writhing in agony. The shadowy figure emerged one last time, its form flickering as the fire consumed it. They barely made it out alive, collapsing on the lawn as the house burned behind them. The screams and whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. But as they watched the house crumble to ash, they noticed something strange. The ground beneath them was shifting, and the air grew cold once more. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. "You'll come back," they said. "They always do." And in the distance, just for a moment, they saw the outline of the Hollow Hill house, standing as if it had never burned at all. The friends stood frozen, staring at the outline of the Hollow Hill house as it materialized in the distance. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. The house was back, and it was angrier than ever. "This isn't possible," Jake muttered, his voice trembling. "We burned it down. We saw it burn." "It doesn't care about what's possible," Emma whispered, her eyes locked on the house. "It's not just a house. It's alive, and it's not letting us go." Before they could react, the ground beneath them began to crack. Thick, black tendrils erupted from the earth, wrapping around their legs and pulling them toward the house. They screamed and struggled, but the tendrils were impossibly strong, dragging them across the ground like puppets on strings. "Fight it," Chris shouted, clawing at the dirt. But the harder they fought, the tighter the tendrils gripped. As they were pulled closer to the house, the front door creaked open, revealing a yawning darkness. The whispers turned into laughter, deep, guttural, and inhuman. The house was mocking them. Inside, the walls were no longer crumbling. They were pulsating, fleshy and wet, as if the house had transformed into some monstrous organism. The floor was slick with a dark, viscous liquid that smelled of rot. The air was thick with the sound of dripping water and the occasional distant scream. The tendrils released them just inside the doorway, and the door slammed shut behind them. The friends huddled together, their flashlights flickering weakly against the oppressive darkness. "We need to find a way out," Mia said, her voice shaking, "before it's too late." But the house had other plans. The walls began to close in, forcing them to move deeper into the structure. They stumbled through narrow hallways that seemed to shift and change, leading them in circles. Every door they opened revealed a new horror, a room filled with writhing shadows, a closet packed with human bones, a mirror that showed their reflections as decaying corpses. Then they heard it, a faint melodic humming. It was coming from upstairs. The sound was soothing, almost hypnotic, and against their better judgment, they followed it. The stairs creaked under their weight, and the humming grew louder. At the top of the stairs, they found a door slightly ajar, light spilling out from the crack. The humming was coming from inside. "Don't," Emma warned. "It's a trap." But Jake pushed the door open anyway. Inside was a perfectly preserved nursery, bathed in warm, golden light. A rocking chair moved slowly on its own, and in the corner, a music box played the haunting tune they had been hearing. This wasn't here before," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper as they stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind them. The music box stopped abruptly, and the room plunged into darkness. When the lights flickered back on, the nursery was gone. They were standing in a decrepit, blood-stained room. The walls were covered in scratch marks, and in the center of the room stood the shadowy figure, its hollow eyes fixed on them. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice echoing from all directions. "You belong to the house now. The friends backed away, but the figure lunged at them, its form shifting into a grotesque amalgamation of their worst fears. Jake screamed as it grabbed him, its claws digging into his skin. The others tried to pull him free, but the figure was too strong. "Run!" Jake shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "Get out of here!" But before they could move, the floor beneath them gave way, and they fell into a dark, endless void. They tumbled through the darkness, their screams echoing around them. When they finally landed, they were in the basement again, the same basement they had escaped from before. But this time it was different. The walls were lined with mirrors, and in each mirror they saw themselves, but not as they were. Their reflections were twisted, monstrous versions of themselves, their eyes black and their faces contorted with rage. "What is this?" Mia cried, backing away from her reflection. "It's showing us what we'll become," Emma said, her voice hollow. "If we stay here." The reflections began to move on their own, stepping out of the mirrors and into the room. The friends were surrounded by their own monstrous doubles, each one more horrifying than the last. "We have to fight them," Chris said, grabbing a piece of broken wood from the floor. "It's the only way." But as they fought, they realized the monsters were too strong. Every blow they landed seemed to have no effect, and the monsters only grew more aggressive. Just as all hope seemed lost, Emma remembered something: the photograph they had found in the box. She pulled it out of her pocket and held it up. The monsters froze, their hollow eyes fixed on the photograph. The shadowy figure appeared behind them, its form flickering. "You think I will save you?" it hissed. "You're already part of the house." But Emma noticed something in the photograph, a faint symbol etched into the corner. It was the same symbol she had seen in an old book about occult rituals. It was a binding symbol, used to trap spirits. "We have to trap it," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We have to bind the house." The friends formed a circle, holding the photograph in the center. They chanted the words Emma remembered from the book, their voices growing louder as the house began to shake. The walls cracked and the floor splintered, but they didn't stop. The shadowy figure screamed, its form dissolving into smoke. The monsters faded away, and the house began to collapse around them. They ran for the exit, the ground crumbling beneath their feet. As they burst out of the house, it exploded in a burst of flames, the screams of the dead echoing in the night. They collapsed on the lawn, gasping for breath, as the house burned to the ground. But as the flames died down, they noticed something strange. The ground was still shifting, and the whispers were still there, faint but unmistakable. "You'll come back," they said. "They always do." And in the distance, just for a moment, they saw the outline of the Hollow Hill house, standing as if it had never burned at all. The nightmare wasn't over. It would never be over. The house would always be waiting, ready to claim its next victims. The friends sat in stunned silence, their bodies shaking from exhaustion. The embers of the house smoldered, filling the air with the acrid scent of burned wood and something else. Something foul, something rotten. Jake coughed, clutching his arm where the shadowy figure had grabbed him. His skin was ice cold, the veins beneath blackened and spreading like ink through water. "We need to go," Emma whispered. "Now." But before they could move, a sharp crack echoed through the night. The ground beneath them trembled, and from the ashes of Hollow Hill House, something stirred. A single, charred hand shot up from the smoldering wreckage. The fingers were elongated, skeletal, but the flesh was still moving, knitting itself back together as if time itself was reversing. Another hand followed, then a head. The skin peeled back like burned paper, revealing something that was neither man nor ghost, but something in between, something that had waited far too long to be set free. It screamed, a sound that rattled inside their skulls. The whispers around them crescendoed into a chorus of laughter. The house was never the monster. It was the prison, and now the thing inside was free. Mia grabbed Emma's wrist. What do we do? What do we do? Emma could barely breathe. The symbol, the ritual, they had trapped it, but they had never destroyed it. And now it was loose. Chris yanked Jake up. We need to run. Jake didn't move. His eyes were wide, his breathing ragged. She's still in there, he whispered. Emma turned sharply. What? Jake's face was pale, his pupils blown wide with terror. I saw her in the mirror. He swallowed hard. My sister. Emma's stomach dropped. No, Mia said, shaking her head. That's not possible. She died in that house. I saw her. Jake's voice cracked. She was calling to me. She's still in there. The creature, still reforming, let out another guttural shriek. The shadows around them rippled, stretching toward them, reaching. Emma grabbed Jake's shoulders. Listen to me. That's not your sister. It's the house. It's trying to. Before she could finish, Jake was gone. The shadows had swallowed him whole, dragging him back toward the ruins. His scream cut through the night. Jake! The others lunged forward, but it was too late. He was inside again. Chris looked at the ruins, at the writhing shadows pulling themselves back together, reforming walls, windows, a door. His breath hitched. It's rebuilding itself. Mia grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. Then we have to stop it. For good. But the house had already decided. The door creaked open, an invitation. And from within, Jake's voice echoed, distorted and broken. Please help me. They had burned it once. They had survived it once. But the house wasn't just a house. It was hungry that a single, charred hand shot up from the smoldering wreckage. The fingers were elongated, skeletal, their blackened flesh barely clinging to the bone. The friends froze as the hand twitched. Then another shot up, followed by another. The ground beneath the ruins of the house boiled, as if something beneath was clawing its way to the surface. Then a scream, not from the ruins, but from behind them. Mia whipped around just in time to see Ryan being dragged backward, his feet scraping against the dirt as unseen hands yanked him toward the shadows. Ryan! Emma shrieked, lunging forward, but the darkness swallowed him whole. His scream cut off, as if he had been erased from existence. Where did he go? Chris gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Before they could process what had happened, a chilling lullaby drifted through the trees. It was the same haunting melody from the music box, but this time, it was sung by a voice too deep, too broken to be human. The air around them shifted. The burning remains of the house suddenly weren't burning anymore. The flames reversed, curling back into the skeletal frame of the building as if time itself were unraveling. Then, all at once, the house stood again, completely restored. The friends stared in horror as the front door creaked open on its own. Inside, flickering candlelight illuminated the long hallway. The house was waiting for them. Jake staggered back, clutching his arm. The dark veins had spread up his neck, creeping toward his jaw. His breath came in short gasps. It's inside me, he choked out. I can hear it. Mia grabbed him, shaking him. We have to leave. Now. But before they could run, the sky above them split open. A deafening roar erupted from the heavens, and a black mass of tendrils crashed down from the clouds, slamming into the ground like an unholy storm. The tendrils writhed, lashing out the group. Chris screamed as one wrapped around his waist and yanked him into the air. His body convulsed as if something was trying to crawl inside him. His eyes rolled back, and when they returned, they were pitch black. The tendrils released him, letting him drop motionless to the ground. Emma hesitated, her breath ragged. Chris! Chris slowly stood up, but something was wrong. His limbs moved with a sickening crack, as if his bones had been rearranged. His face twitched, his lips twisting into an unnatural grin. Then, in a voice that was both his and not his, he whispered, "You should never come back." And then, he charged at them. The friends screamed as Chris lunged, his mouth splitting open wider than humanly possible, revealing rows of jagged, blood-stained teeth. Jake grabbed a fallen branch and swung hard. The impact knocked Chris back, but he didn't stop. His body snapped back into place, and he advanced again. "We have to get inside," Emma yelled, already sprinting toward the house. "The house wants us in there," Mia argued. "It doesn't matter," Emma shouted. "It's the only place left." With no other choice, they ran through the open door, leaving Chris behind. The moment they stepped inside, the door slammed shut, trapping them in the dark. And then, the whispering began again. This time, it wasn't distant. It was right behind them. Something was breathing on their necks. Mia turned first and screamed. Standing mere inches away was Ryan, but he wasn't the same. His skin was gray, his eyes black pits dripping with thick, inky sludge. His mouth stretched too wide, revealing a yawning abyss inside his throat. And then, he whispered in that awful, gurgling voice, "You never left." The house was never going to let them go. It had them now, and it was just getting started. Mia's scream shattered the silence. Ryan's grotesque, decayed form stood before them, his black, sludge-dripping eyes boring into her. His mouth moved, but the words that came out were distorted, layered with countless voices, some whispering, others sobbing, and one that sounded exactly like Mia's own voice, pleading, "Help me. Please help me." Emma grabbed Mia's arm and yanked her back. "It's not him. That's not Ryan." Ryan lurched forward, his movements unnatural, like a marionette with its strings yanked by an unseen force. His arms were too long, the joints bending the wrong way. His fingers, once human, had become sharp, bone-white talons, clicking together like insect legs. Jake let out a choked gasp. His skin was changing. The black veins crawling up his neck were now pulsing, writhing like something alive beneath the surface. His fingernails peeled away, falling to the floor like dead leaves, revealing something dark and glistening underneath. Jake panted, clutching his hands. "I can feel it moving." Then he screamed. The veins burst open, and from the wounds, tiny, wriggling tendrils slithered out, curling and grasping at the air. They weren't veins at all. They were roots spreading from inside him, burrowing outward like an infection. Emma covered her mouth, her sanity unraveling. "This isn't real," she whispered. "This can't be real." But the house responded, whispering into her ear, its voice inside her head now. "Real is whatever I say it is." Suddenly, the walls around them shifted. The house was moving, rearranging itself like a living organism. The wallpaper peeled away in wet, meaty strips, revealing something pulsating underneath. The floors beneath them buckled, then opened up. Jake let out a choked gasp as his own veins pulsed violently, the black tendrils beneath his skin writhing like they had a life of their own. His breathing grew ragged. I think it's inside me," he whispered. His pupils were dilating unnaturally, his irises flickering between colors. His voice sounded layered, his and something else's. Before anyone could react, Ryan let out a wet, gurgling shriek and lunged. Emma and Mia dodged just in time as he collapsed on all fours, his spine snapping backward with a sickening crack, his body stretched, limbs elongating, skin splitting open in places to reveal pulsing muscle and writhing black sinew beneath. The thing that had been Ryan lifted its head, its jaw unhinged wider than humanly possible, and from the abyss of its throat, a third hand shot out, long, withered fingers reaching for him. "Run!" Emma screamed. The group bolted, pushing deeper into the house, the air growing thicker around them. The walls groaned and pulsed, like a breathing organism. Shadows slithered along the floor, stretching unnaturally. Something was watching them from the walls. They burst into a hallway that hadn't been there before, long and narrow, lined with mirrors on either side. The reflections inside were wrong, distorted, warped nightmares of themselves. Mia stepped forward and froze. Her reflection was smiling. She wasn't. The mirror Mia raised a finger to her lips and whispered, "Shoo, he can't hear you." Then the mirror shattered, and a dozen pale arms shot out from the shards, grabbing at her. She screamed as the hands dragged her toward the glass, her body twisting unnaturally as her reflection laughed soundlessly. Emma grabbed her, yanking hard, but the mirror was pulling her in, her body halfway through the glass, her legs dangling in another dimension where shapes moved hungrily in the darkness. Then Jake moved. His body was convulsing, the black veins bulging beneath his skin, but he stepped forward and slammed his fist in the mirror, shattering it completely. Mia collapsed to the floor, gasping, the mirror's arms dissolving into dust. But Jake wasn't okay. He was staring at his hands, trembling. His fingernails had fallen off, replaced by thin, jagged claws. His teeth elongated, his gums blackened. His skin was peeling away in strips, revealing something wrong underneath. "Guys," he choked out, "I'm changing." Emma and Mia watched in horror as his face contorted, his bones shifting beneath his skin. His mouth split wider, his cheeks stretching as if his skin no longer fit his skull. Then, he let out a sound that wasn't human, a deep, guttural growl, like something ancient and starving. Mia backed away. "Jake, you need to fight it." But Jake wasn't there anymore. His eyes turned completely black, and when he looked at them, his voice was a whisper from the void. "The house doesn't want me to fight it." Then, he lunged at them. Emma and Mia screamed, bolting down the twisting hallway. The mirrors around them shattered violently, releasing distorted versions of themselves, bloody, broken creatures with missing eyes and screaming mouths. The house was breaking them, and it was only getting started. Emma and Mia ran, the walls of the house twisting and melting around them. The hallway stretched and shrank, the floor buckling as if it was made of flesh instead of wood. Behind them, Jake was no longer Jake. His body had split open, his ribs unfurling like a grotesque cage, something black and writhing living inside. His head had elongated, his jaw permanently unhinged, his voice now a wet, slithering whisper. "You can't leave," he gurgled. "You've never left." Emma slammed into a door at the end of the hallway, fumbling with the handle. The walls groaned like a living thing, veins pulsating through the wood. She yanked the door open and found herself standing outside the house. The front yard stretched before them, the night sky wrong, the stars twisting in unnatural spirals. Mia gasped, grabbing Emma's arm. We made it." Then they heard it, a voice behind them, their own voices. Emma turned and froze. Standing on the porch were Emma and Mia, perfect copies of them. Their doppelgangers stood motionless, watching. Their eyes were empty, like puppets waiting for strings to be pulled. The air rippled, and suddenly, the house wasn't there anymore. Instead, they were back in a basement, standing in the center of a massive ritual circle drawn in blood. The walls were lined with mirrors, and in each mirror, they saw themselves, but twisted, monstrous, decayed versions. Jake, or what was left of him, stood in the center, his body half consumed by the black mass inside him. His lips curled into a grotesque smile. "You don't get it, do you?" His voice was layered, echoing from the walls themselves. Mia's breath hitched. No, we got out." Jake let out a horrible, wet laugh. "You've never left. You never will. The house wasn't real. None of this was." Emma's heart pounded. This is a loop." Jake nodded, his black veins writhing. "Not just a loop." His grin widened, revealing too many teeth. "You were the house." Emma felt a violent pull inside her skull. Her memories, her life before this, were fracturing, slipping away like sand through her fingers. She could feel the walls breathing through her own lungs. The whispers were her own thoughts. Mia screamed, clutching her head. No, no, this isn't real. But it was. The truth crashed over them like a tidal wave of horror. They weren't people trapped in the house. They had always been part of it. Their minds had been playing out this scenario over and over as the house fed off their suffering, their fear. They weren't trying to escape. They were fueling the house. That's why every time they escaped, the house returned, because they were the ones rebuilding it. Jake's flesh peeled away, revealing only writhing shadows beneath. His form stretched, consuming the room. You're home now, he whispered. The walls collapsed inward, and Emma and Mia screamed as their bodies melted into the house itself, their flesh and bones becoming part of the pulsing, shifting walls. Their minds fractured, their thoughts splintering into thousands of voices. They became the whispers. They became the house. And outside, in the distance, a new group of friends approached Hollow Hill House, staring up at its towering, ominous frame. The cycle was about to begin again, and this time, Emma and Mia would be waiting. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.